Alex Zaharov-Reutt is talking tech on today's News Talk, TNT.
Thank you for joining us again. Now, I'm here with Chris Griffith. He's an award-winning journalist, a communications professional, a technology reporter, writer, commentator, and speaker. Chris, welcome to the program.
Alex, great to be on your program after all these years of knowing you. Finally, we're doing this.
Yeah, collaborating. I really appreciate it. Now, Chris, you've had a long career in technology, starting in 1976. I was only 2 years old at the time as a computing studies teacher, all the way through to spending 15 years as the senior writer for technology at The Australian, which is one of the big newspapers in Australia. And then the last year and a half as a self-employed freelancer. And that career has spanned 48 years. Now, we'll go into more detail on the big aspects of technological change in a moment. But can you please tell us a bit about yourself and your incredible 48-year career?
Well, I guess you could add another 7 years to that, because I first learnt computing at school. It was a pilot course run by the Victorian Education Department. I'm pretty sure it was 1969, and it was brought in as part of our math syllabus that year. And that's where I learnt to do some coding using those famous porta punch cards where you use a paper clip, a bit like how you prod out a SIM card, but to punch holes in it. So that sort of whet my appetite. And when I went to university, I enrolled in, you couldn't do a total computer science course, but you could do what they said called information science and maths through uni. Worked at on mainframes for a little while on a company called Norcross, which sold greeting cards, a very futuristic invoicing and dispatch system with them. But I wanted to teach as well, and I went into TAFE education. I went to a school, a TAFE college, Preston TAFE first. And it's very interesting. It was right after the end of the Whitlam government. There was a lot of money in TAFE. And there, and I was the only computer teacher that they'd ever had. And there was a studio with 2 camera people, nothing to do. So we decided that I'd present my classes and we'd videotape them for our night students. So I was doing kind of television type teaching. There was no syllabus, and they said, "Do you mind? Could you write syllabus?" So I got to learn to write syllabus, and that was a skill that was particularly useful as I got into journalism, because if you're writing syllabus, you need to think about how people can people have got to understand it, or you're wasting your time. So you've got to break everything down simply, and I think that skill has helped me a lot over the years in writing technology. But after many years in the TAFE system in Victoria and Queensland, in the early 80s, I formed a little startup. We never called it startups in the 80s. We had a mini company with myself and another mate. He was a hardware expert who'd worked in Mount Isa Mines Computing Centre. I was a software writer, and the PC era had just begun. And we learned how to network PCs so we could go into a business in Queensland where we operated, and we could build a network PC system for data entry or whatever they wanted at thousands of dollars less than they'd otherwise pay using a mini mainframe, which was the smaller cut-down mainframes that business were using. And we made a really good living out of that. We had a very bohemian lifestyle, living in an old rundown Queenslander in St. Lucia, near the around there, near the river, near the Brisbane River, and did that for quite a few years. The biggest system I had took over a year to build. We had a prototype developed as a standalone system. But I created a network version, and that was in body corporate management. If you know how complicated operating body corporates are, and there's everything from the debtors and creditors to calling of meetings and issuing levies and that, we had that running for 14,000 apartments in Queensland by the mid-1980s, before the internet era. So that took me to the 90s, and I was the sort of person, I was always interested in doing other stuff. When I was doing one thing, I always saw the greener grass about other things. And Went back to uni, funded from our business. I did another degree in journalism. And excuse me, this is my Apple AirPods. I have two different sizes of ears, and that doesn't really help.
We can hear you. That's okay.
Yeah, and the rest is, I've worked
History.
on TV a bit and radio, and then a series of newspapers culminating in the odds. That's right. So that's I hope that's not too long for your readers, but
that's okay. A bit of a pot of history. Look, I mean, people can go to your LinkedIn page and see all that you have.
They can see the rest.
Those. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now we've had the personal. So you've told us a bit about sort of your journey through the world of tech, but we've had the personal computing revolution of the late 70s and the early 80s. Then we had the internet revolution of the 90s, the smartphone revolution of the 2000s, the tablet computing revolution of the 2010s, and now we are in the generative AI era, which is also now joined by the Vision Pro revolution. So you've lived through it all, and we've heard a little bit about your overall thoughts on technology. But how else do you think? What are your thoughts on how technology has progressed over this last half century?
I guess we've seen it going from being a kind of grassroots revolution, which it was with everyone programming, and I'd go to those computer meetings and we learn how to, do some shortcuts and we write those in the paper, to the emergence. I think the last 20 years we've seen the emergence of the big, very cashed up global companies running tech. And that's been great. I never decry their fantastic innovation that they've brought to tech. I'm talking about, Apple, Google, all of those guys. We're now at a phase, particularly brought on by generative AI, of wanting to kind of put it in perspective, to regulate it, not to over-regulate it, but to make sure those big companies don't become totally predatory, just stomping over people's rights, whether it's copyright law, protecting authors and so on, but generally protecting IP. And I think what happened with OpenAI, Sam Altman and co were so keen to get into market so quickly, they really didn't think a lot or enough about some of these ethical implications. And government, on the other hand, now is having to do that. But government isn't really equipped to moving so quickly. Government is, for years, been always behind in regulating technology because it's so hard to understand, let alone work out what the rules around it should be. But generative AI is a huge challenge to government, to even over its sovereignty, like where the laws operate in a global market and so on. So I think the last 20 years we've seen the big companies come out there. We've seen the domination by, the dominance of Apple and Google and so on. But we're seeing on top of that social media. So we've got the big companies, social media, dominance of the phones and tablets type markets. And we're now grappling with, how we get that balance right between innovation and protecting people's rights.
So ChatGPT, entered the sort of zeitgeist in November 2022. Last year was all about the AI revolution, and this year, of course, it's going to get go supernova, as I was saying to Vinay before in the previous video interview. So, how do you use AI in your daily life at the moment as a journalist and for anything else?
Well, I've been careful not to overuse it because it's our brain power as journalists and our perceptions of what's going on that's important. I don't think ChatGPT ever tells me what I should be focusing on in journalism. That's part of the skills to look about on the panorama and what you should be writing about. Frankly, I haven't used it much at all for telling stories. I have used it a few times just to try and sort out some of the research that I've got there, but you can't trust it, certainly these iterations. I have used a lot, though, for the thing that is often difficult on websites, and that is having enough illustrations, like illustrating stories. When you're dealing with some of the sites I have use WordPress, and you've got to have that key image. And websites anyway, news sites look terrible without any images at all. And I've used mainly Bing GTP, which is now Copilot, to build images for stories. and some of them are hilarious. Like I was actually for our body corporate site, and I needed a representation about sinking funds, and it drew this kind of 18th century ship that looked like the in Denver, and all this money that had gone overboard and was, sinking into the ocean. I mean, that's how you join the dots sometimes with ChatGPT. But illustration's been pretty good, and I know as we move on with GTV5, we had inklings of this before about video, that hopefully what we're going to see is the ability of GDP to go through and literally, go through, process videos and movies and make that available in summary form in text, and go even further. Maybe one day we'll soon create videos just by explaining what we want in the video. We're very interested to see that.
Well, there's something called Pika.art and also Google Lumiere, and these are text to video platforms. And I've been saying for the past, 3 or 4 months or so that I think sometime later this year or maybe next year, we're going to have the first hit TV show or movie created by somebody, some kid in their bedroom, all done through text to video. People are doing it now, but it's just not something that's worthy of the cinema yet.
Yeah, I mean, Alex, getting the stuff going, the technology is one thing, but having the nuances and capabilities of a producer, that'll take a lot longer. I'm not saying it's impossible, but you look at all the great directors and producers and their styles and the way they use lighting, and there's a lot of emotion and a lot of humanity in movies, which I think is going to be a big pull to replicate at that view. So I tend to think the videos will be probably technically good, but they'll probably be pretty bland. I mean, a lot of ChatGPT is very clever and fantastic in terms of the knowledge it can reproduce, but in terms of writing styles and that, it tends to be, pretty ordinary, not fantastic.
Now, we've seen Google announce yesterday, the 9th of February, as we're recording, that it's going to have it's now called Gemini. They've changed the name from Bard to Gemini. But there's also reports that Apple has purchased 22 AI companies over the past year or so. It will make a huge AI push at WWDC 2024 in the middle of this year, their worldwide developer conference. So what are you expecting from Apple?
Apple's tended to keep its powder dry, and we've seen this now, in the Cook era as opposed to the Jobs era where Apple trailblazed. In the Cook era, they take things fairly carefully. They look at how the market develops, and we've seen that with provision, really. I mean, we've had VR headsets out for quite some time, and I mean, this is not a VR system; it's a AR, augmented reality, which I think has got a good chance of doing pretty well, because Apple put the boundaries around what their devices will do. And I think Apple obviously will come into the generative AI market, but I think they'll be pretty careful and scrupulous about, what the veracity of the information is, how accurate it is, where they're sourcing the information from. And they'll avoid the issues where they possibly can around misinformation and privacy breaches. That tends to be Apple's playbook at the moment. They'll do it, but they'll hang back. They'll put their own imprimatur on it to make it different from everyone else's. So this is the Apple way of doing things. But I think they'll be a bit more careful than some of the early iterations.
Yeah, no, I believe so as well. I mean, normally Apple does something and it shows the rest of the industry how, well, at least Apple thinks it should be done, and then all of a sudden everybody else seems to copy that. And I know that although Vision Pro is more augmented reality than virtual reality, you can spin the digital crown on top of the glasses, and then you can immerse yourself in this world which doesn't let you see out. You can block the outside world completely. And currently you can use those Bluetooth controllers from Sony, PlayStation, Logitech, and others to play traditional games that would normally be on your iPad. But there's nothing, as far as I can tell, that's stopping Apple from having those virtual reality experiences that you get on the Meta Quest Pro. And I guess we'll probably learn more about that at the middle of the year, or even perhaps with the Vision Pro 2. But you did touch on misinformation and disinformation there. And I mean, You also touched on over-regulation. We don't want to see too much of that, but with misinformation and disinformation being one of the big things that's happening in Australia and also other governments around the world, they want to set themselves up as arbiters of what's right and wrong. But given there's been so much government claims about what happened with COVID, can we trust governments to be the good arbiters of misinformation and disinformation when sometimes they seem to be the ones dishing it out?
Well, I think, it's a mixture of, there may be nefarious sort of government type activities around censorship. There are a lot of well-meaning people in the government that are concerned, and they're lobbied and pressured around, the type of content that children can see and the type of bad information online. So I think it's not a hard and fast rule in some countries. I think government will be striving to do the right thing. In Australia, I think the moves to do this are well intentioned. We've got elections coming up in this country next year, and the US elections at the end of the year. Russia goes to the polls. I don't know how it's going to work there, but elections really can be compromised by fake videos of leaders saying things that they never would say, making admissions they'd never make. And by the time Meta and co get around to doing something about it, it's too late. Millions of people have seen this. And I think the biggest question now is, how are these big companies going to manage the very regulations that they've made around this? Because I think they're struggling. Meta's struggling. X, we know, Elon Musk got rid of so many of the employees involved in monitoring what was on Twitter and so on, for misinformation and bots and so on. So we have, if I dare say, the fabric of our democratic society to a large extent is in play through what's going on online, and it's a big question. And as I just said, regulation is one thing, but being able to enforce the regulations is the big test, and you need lots of people, lots of very well-tuned algorithms, and a whole lot of things to come together. I don't think we're there, anything like being there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And look, the issue of deepfakes, originally deepfakes, they looked a bit dodgy. You could sort of tell it wasn't quite right. And in fact, somebody sent me a video of a deepfake of Biden, debating a deepfake of Trump. And within 3 seconds, I knew that it had to be fake because Biden sounded incredibly lucid, which is not how Biden sounds today. They used audio of him from a few years ago, and it just sounded spot on. But look, Meta, for the old Facebook company, they want to create an open source large language model. Is anyone going to trust them? Elon Musk has been on a 20-year apology tour, and he was just in Congress earlier this week apologizing to parents for all the various things that Instagram and Facebook have been allowing on the internet. And the 20-year apology tour, I don't think I'd trust the open source large language model from Facebook. Would you?
Well, no, I got to say that I try and keep a positive view about our big tech companies, and I think to a large extent Microsoft, I have a reasonable amount of trust for them. I'm not saying total by any means, but more than others. But Meta, we've seen it really abuse its position in the way it's trained its large language models. Went into chapter and verse about a particular repository of 196,000 books that had been put there for, I guess, people who were not associated with companies to try have some data for training large language models. And Meta came along and drank from it and used all that, and at the same time says it doesn't believe it owes them an acknowledgement or compensation or that. It just makes me feel that their native tendency is more exploitative, that really they'll do what they can get away with, and they'll probably be caught out being unable to manage their own regulations a lot. And given their dominance with Facebook and Instagram and they're on Threads, I'm kind of really worried about what's going to happen in the next 12 months in the misinformation space.
Yeah, well, we've got the big tech censorship issues in the States where the US government has to abide by the First Amendment, but US companies don't have to comply. And that's, I think, causing problems. I mean, the government's been able to sort of go through the companies to censor people when, in theory, the US Constitution doesn't allow that. So I don't know if you have any comments on that. But I mean, we don't even have First Amendment protections here in Australia.
Well, this is where, the whole landscape of big tech companies and AI challenges, us to the very constitution. We haven't really, we didn't in 1901 think about how we're going to frame our constitution for AI in 2024, nor should we be able to. But we're in that space, and well, you're right to be skeptical about governments, but on the other hand, if the big tech companies can't do it, I think citizens are going to have to rely a bit on government to fill that space, or to really push, and if they're not going to do it, to push and pressure the big tech companies to make sure they're resourced to enforce their regulations in that. We're going to be interesting to watch what's happening in Europe. I think Europe is a fascinating landscape because I know people are worried about overregulation as well as a lack of enforcement on the other hand. Well, the DMA Act in Europe, that's a Digital Marketing Act where they deal with antitrust and big tech companies in like on our phones enforcing us or getting us to use their apps or making it more advantageous to shop with them, using their payment systems in their app stores. All of that gets blown up on March the 6th. Apple and Co. have to abide by the rules of the Digital Markets Act. And so that's less than a month away. And that's going to be a test case. That's not specifically about AI, but it's in that area of who can rein in whom, between governments and the big tech companies. And I think the answer at the end of the day is if we don't trust either, maybe what we do trust is the combination of the two, keeping an eye on each other and, we as journalists keeping an eye on government. That's probably going to be the modus operandi if we can't find any other way of doing it.
Yeah. Well, and journalists keeping an eye on the companies too. Now, privacy is also something that the big tech companies like to play fast and loose with. How often are you checking your privacy settings in the various apps and platforms that you're using?
Well, I guess Apple's been a little bit better in this, mainly because their whole business model doesn't depend so much on sharing data, and we've seen the standoff between Apple and Mark Zuckerberg over Apple's move to allow users to limit the data going from the app they're on to other apps, which has been the big thing. You're using app A and app B, C, and D while they're just sitting on your phone are actually scooping up what you're doing and learning from it. And that was what Apple have dealt with. And we're seeing Google, change from their cookie system and so on. So privacy is a big issue. I do think the public generally are a little, strange things to say, but a bit more relaxed about it in the sense that they accept that there will be some use of their online habits. People now, I think, more accept that it might be advantageous that if they're using certain devices, they might get ads that are relevant to what there is. But the big areas of concern around privacy, I think, are still around the big privacy breaches and the stealing of data and the likelihood that people's IDs, they will be stolen. That's the area that is a biggest concern. But yeah, around marketing still it's a problem. I mean, I used to it was quite amusing to me because it shows how these apps don't work properly is I would do reviews at the Australian on certain devices and I'd be looking up, doing the research beforehand on some of the aspects. And then for the next week, even though I'm not buying it, but after when and after my review was produced, I'd get ads for the stuff that I was actually reviewing. But I'm not a buyer of it. But that's how. But I think that is not, as I've just said, that is not probably the central privacy issue. The central privacy issue is people pinching our Medicare data, people's data about their mental health consultations and diagnoses, and and various diseases that they don't want in, whether they're on drugs or whether someone's had an abortion, for example. Those are the sorts of privacy matters that we have to really keep dealing with in online communication.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, there's so many more things we can talk about, but you're going to the big Mobile World Congress in Barcelona. Is that the first time you've been? It's going to be, I think, next
No, I've been there
month.
several
What are you
times.
expecting to see there? Okay.
I've been following.
Yeah,
last year I was there, and I think we'll see more of that. There's a very interesting kind of rollout of low Earth orbit satellites and their connections to our terrestrial network, so that soon we'll be able to use our ordinary mobile phones, go 300 kilometres west of Uluru, and while there's no ground network, be able to make text first, then calls, then video calls from the middle of nowhere, and that links into Optus and Telstra. They've signed deals with Elon Musk with Starlink to produce that. We've got Amazon getting more active in Australia with its ground networks, which have been operating a few years. So I expect to see more of that, and we're starting to see these known as satellite as a service, being sold in that way, and that's a big issue. We're also seeing technologies around light. I saw last year around radio waves, but also light. They're calling it Li-Fi.
Yes, I remember hearing with that. We're about to go. LinkedIn is the best place to find your work. Well, look, thank you so much for joining us today. Yeah, I really appreciate it, Chris. We'll talk to you again in the future. This has been Alex, Talking Tech with Alex Zaharov-Reutt.
To hear a replay of this hour, go to episodes at tntradio.live.